So this story today I'm about to tell you is probably one of the most inspirational stories you'll probably ever hear. But before we get into it, make sure you like and subscribe and all the other good stuff, and that'll be brilliant. Thank you. So the story starts off in Iceland with a man called Felix, and he was an engineer and he worked for a power company. But more specifically, he worked for the department who controlled like the overhead power lines, like the big massive power lines which would like run over the streets and stuff. Yeah, them like really powerful things. So when he arrived to work that one morning, as usual, there was a report of one of these overhead power cables being malfunctioning, and he was set off to go and fix this problem. So on his way to work that morning, it was still quite dark, as it was still quite early, and being in Iceland, it was still it was still quite dark out. But he knew that when he approached this river, he knew if he followed the river, it would eventually direct him to the power line which he was set to work on. But with -11 winds blowing that morning, he had to have his hat sort of pulled down like just over his eyes, and he had his jumper just pulled up like just below his eyes, which meant he couldn't really see where he was going, but he thought he knew the area well enough that he didn't fully need to exactly look where he's going. So as he approached the power line, which he thought was the one he was going to work on, he climbed up, and then he went to go and grab the power line to start working on it, but he soon realised that he did not pick the right one. So as he grabbed onto the power line, 11,000 volts would have instantly shot directly into him. But luckily, some miraculous reason, the current of the voltage, it didn't travel through his body, meaning it didn't travel through his heart. So it literally went through his hand, and then it bounced across his one arm into the other arm, and then went back up again and then back into the ground, meaning his body effectively didn't absorb any of the electric which came from the power line, meaning eventually he just dropped to the ground. But his injuries were still very severe, as he broke his back in 3 places, he broke his neck, and also he 3 of his ribs were misplaced, and obviously very serious problems. So if them volts would have got into his heart, then he would have died instantly. But then the fact that he fell as well was the big saviour in his life, because normally if you're gonna receive that many volts, your body would kind of lock into position, and eventually you would catch fire and you would sort of burn to death. But with his release, he fell to the ground, broke his back, broke his neck, and misplaced some of his ribs. Them injuries were nowhere near as bad as they should have been, really. Felix then went on to say it was not a very good morning. So as he lay on the floor, some of his colleagues come running over, with one of them carrying a bottle of water which he received from the river that Felix was previously following, and he put the fire out on his arms, because his arms were in full-on flames. And then another one of his colleagues reported that he had a few of his fingers had been burnt off. So his colleagues never really realised the severity of this incident, but as he was sent into hospital, the doctors performed a biopsy on his body and realised that there was no blood flow in his arm. Then he was placed into a coma, and then as he was in his coma, his parents, family, friends all come and visited him, essentially to say bye, really, because no one really believed he was going to survive this 11,000 voltage shock. But his father was the only person who stood over him, and he was convinced that Felix was going to be fine, he was going to survive, he was going to get through it, and he was right. The parts of both of Felix's arms were amputated, but as the doctors realised that the infection was just spreading further and further up his arm, they just had to keep on chopping off more of his arm until eventually it got to his shoulders, and then they stopped. So he had a total of 54 surgeries, which was for the amputations and to mend his back and neck and ribs. Then in 1998, things went from bad to worse, as his liver started to fail. His liver was barely holding on, and the doctors thought that potentially the liver could maybe heal on its own, but the chances of this happening were very slim. Otherwise, if his liver was not to heal on its own, he would have had to go in to have a liver transplant. Later that year, Felix was released from hospital, but he was taken off the medication he was on, which was to numb the pain. So obviously, with his pain being so high, with his arms, with just his general pain, he went on to drug and alcohol use, which eventually led into addiction. So he mainly used cannabis and cocaine to numb the pain, but he didn't think that the use of these two substances will make his liver any worse than it already was. Then after a few months of being addicted to the drugs, he eventually came round to himself and he realised that he is not in a good place, and if he carries on using the drugs, he's never going to get better, and he's never going to live the life he once lived. So Felix was 5'9" and he was only weighing around 40 kilos at the time, and his skin was extremely yellow, he was armless, and he had a liver which was failing him. So he went on and told the truth to the doctor about his drug use and explained as to why his liver wasn't really getting any better. And then the doctor revealed some heartbreaking news to him, which this news led him to change. So with Felix using drugs and alcohol, he would not be accepted for a liver transplant, as people on these substances are never accepted for liver transplants. So this encouraged Felix to go to rehab. But during his rehab, the doctors could not prescribe him with any drugs to help him get off drugs. So he had no choice but to go cold turkey, which obviously made everything a lot longer and a lot more difficult for him. But still, in 3 months, he was completely detoxed. And shortly after he went sober, he received some very incredible news. He was finally accepted for a liver transplant. But unfortunately, when the first liver was transplanted into him, it didn't work very well. So 2 months after, he went in for another liver transplant, which that one went smoothly. So without the success of the liver transplant, then the next operation of putting the 2 arms back on him would not have gone as smoothly as they did. Surprise to Felix, an arm transplant had never been successfully attempted. It had never even been attempted. So this option was not even an option for Felix. He had no clue that this was even an option for him to even try ever. However, the year Felix had his accident, a French doctor had just successfully completed the world's first hand transplant. This brought some life into Felix and he wanted his limbs back. Then in 2007, Felix was watching telly in his living room, and being broadcasted on the news at the time was the same French doctor who completed the first ever hand transplant. He was talking about a partial face reconstruction which he had just successfully completed. So now Felix knows that this French doctor, the one who could potentially give him his arms back, is in the same country as him, and it's only a very small country, so he knows he can find him. So this was the breakthrough for Felix. He knew that this was his chance to get in touch with his French doctor and give him his arms back. So he started off by calling the French embassy, by calling the broadcasting team, by even calling one of his interviewers. But none of them options worked for Felix. So he then went on to trying to call all of the hotels in Iceland, which isn't that many. And then eventually he came through to one of the receptionists, who informed him that this French doctor was staying at this hotel. And then he instantly rushed up to the hotel that he was staying at. He spoke to the receptionist and asked whether he could have a sit-down meeting with the French doctor. But at the time, currently, the French doctor wasn't there. So the receptionist left a message for him, and had the French doctor eventually accepted. And the following day at 6 p.m, Felix and the French doctor were finally sitting in the lobby having the discussion which Felix really needed. So during their meeting, Felix was technically being examined by the doctor, because obviously the doctor needed to know Felix's situation, and Felix asked him the question of whether he knows if he can perform this surgery on Felix, with the doctor's response being, "I don't know." So the doctor then asked for medical notes and medical history, and he said he would let him know. This meeting was the major step forward for Felix, which now he was often going, flying over to France to meet this doctor for constant examinations and just constant checkups on how Felix is doing and on whether they will be able to complete this surgery for him. Then after a few years of Felix travelling back and forth from France, the doctor eventually said to Felix that this surgery is possible, but they're going to need a lot of time and a lot of money. So the surgery was going to cost Felix roughly 150,000 euros, and then on top of that, it's going to cost him an extra 50,000 euros every single month to pay for his rehab, which at the time Felix did not have this kind of money, leaving Felix with his only option of resorting back to the people at Iceland to see whether they can help. And all of the 360,000 people of Iceland, they all came together as a massive community, and they all raised enough money for Felix to have his operation and to cover at least 2 months of his rehab. Felix then said it is a privilege to be part of the Icelandic community. So the surgery was then approved and Felix had the money in the bank. Felix was ready to go. But the only problem is they needed a donor, which proved to be a lot harder than they may have previously thought. Felix then moved to France in preparation for this big procedure because it could literally happen at any time. So the first year of living in France wasn't really a good year for Felix, as it was mainly just like sort of sitting around waiting for the phone call announcing that the donor was ready and that his procedure could start. The second year was just a lot better for Felix as he comes to the realisation that it's going to be a long wait. Then after the long wait, 3 potential donors came up, but the families refused on donating their arms. Felix understood as to why the family members might have rejected, because it was a new procedure, it'd never been done before, and at the time, the family members wouldn't have really been thinking about what effects that their arms could have on Felix, and also the family members were more upset and they were going through a tough time on obviously losing a family member. So Felix completely understood the family member's situation. But eventually a donor was found with approval from the family, so the surgery was good to go. Then on the 12th of January 2021, Felix was placed into the surgery room on his bed. He was surrounded by 50 surgeons with 2 teams based on Felix and 2 teams based on the donor. The main problem that they were going to be facing during the surgery was time. Felix's blood needed to flow into the new donor's arms within 6 hours, otherwise the donor's arms would have died and would have been no good for Felix. The partial bone and shoulder rebuilding had to take place before the arms could be put onto Felix. And then also the nerves in Felix's shoulder, they were sort of in some tiny tubes, which then went into the donor's arms. Then eventually through the tubes, the nerves would grow and grow and grow all the way down into Felix's arms. With the tubes, they would eventually have dissolved, just leaving behind the nerves. So the average growth of nerves is 1 millimetre every single day, meaning that it would take up to 2 years for the nerves to grow from his shoulder all the way down to his fingertip. That was too long of a time for the doctors to determine on whether the surgery was successful or not. They decided to settle with if Felix could move his arms up like that, if he had the movement and feeling in his biceps, then the surgery was a success. But after only 9 months of his surgery, Felix was able to move and feel his fingertips. He wasn't able to fully move them, but he was able to move them enough to know that the nerves were growing, which means his nerves grew incredibly fast during this 9 months. Then after the surgery, he was put on immune suppression medication for the rest of his life to make sure that Felix's body never rejected the arms. This is when the liver transplant came into play. The medication he was put on was extremely heavy, meaning if he had 40 livers, they would have not have been able to absorb or even maintain the medication that he was put on. So his liver was the main reason as to why he was accepted for this massive surgery. So Felix must work hard all day, every day, to make sure that his arms were getting enough exercise. Otherwise, the nerve growth in his arm could either come down to a stop, or they would just either slow down and come to a stop. His end result for his new arms is suspected to be in roughly 3 years' time. So Felix's incredible story instantly blew up, and he was broadcasted across the whole world on mainstream news channels. He was voted Man of the Year when he went back to Iceland. He even had a sit-down meal with his family, with the President of Iceland, and he was officially the pride of Iceland. But none of this fame meant nothing compared to the time he got to spend with his family after his surgery. After 23 long years, he was finally able to give his 2 daughters a hug that they had long been waited for. So when Felix had his accident, he had 2 daughters, one was 4 months old and the other one was 4 years old. And after his surgery, when he come out, finally got to hug them for the first time. One was 24 years old and the other one was 28 years old. And now he's got 4 grandchildren, 2 boys and 2 girls, which he finally has the honour to hold for the first time. He was also able to spend his first Christmas at home since 2014, which had his whole family there, his parents, his wife, his children, long distance cousins. He had everyone around at his first Christmas. Then the month after, in January, Felix's father passed away from COVID. Felix's father was the only person who knew from the day of the accident that Felix was going to be fine. Felix went on to make his father so proud. He brought into a meal with the president, which obviously his father loved. Felix was just really happy to know that his father got to see his full progression and see him at his worst and see him at his best. He come out of hospital the same man he was on the day of his accident. This meant everything to Felix. So Felix obviously went through so much, and like anyone else would, he went through the times of when he thought he wasn't going to get through it, he wasn't going to survive, he wasn't going to live the life he once lived. But like no matter how bad things got for Felix, he pushed himself through it. His attitude to living was there, and it gave him his life back. So Felix's story is probably one of the most inspirational, heartwarming, but heartbreaking stories I've probably ever heard, and probably you've ever heard. But no one tells a story better than Felix does. I'm going to leave a link in the description as to where Felix told his full story. That's going to do it for today. I really hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please don't forget to drop a little like and drop a little subscribe. Also, if you want to check out all my socials, they're all in the description below. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.